Way back in 1938, long before 24-hour news cycles, a really remote Japanese village became the setting for one of the deadliest lone gunman massacres in the country's entire history. It's a dark, dark chapter that tells a pretty chilling story about resentment and revenge.
30. That's how many people lost their lives in a single night of terror. In just about 90 minutes, 30 people, men, women, and even children, were murdered in their own homes. That is a shocking number, even by today's grim standards.
Take a look at this. This is one of the only images we have from the aftermath. On the morning of May 21, 1938, the small village of Kamo woke up to a scene of just unimaginable horror. This was a tight-knit community, only about 100 people, and it was completely shattered overnight.
So how in the world did this night of terror unfold? Let's break down the brutal and honestly the methodical facts of the attack itself.
Okay, so looking at the details here, the attack was shockingly methodical. It happened in the dead of night between 1:30 and 3 a.m. And the killer didn't just have one weapon. He was armed with a Remington shotgun, a traditional katana sword, an axe, and daggers. This wasn't some spontaneous outburst. This was a planned assault.
You know, an event this horrific just doesn't happen in a vacuum. It forces us to ask, who could possibly do something like this? And what could drive a person to seek such devastating revenge on their own community?
Well, the person responsible wasn't some stranger who wandered into town. Nope, he was a young man known by everyone in the village. His name was Mutsuo Toi, just 21 years old. And he wasn't an outsider, not at all. He was born and raised right there in Kamo, brought up by his grandmother. Every single one of his victims knew his face.
But it's strange, because Toi's life seems to have been a story in two completely different parts. People remembered him as an outgoing boy, a good student. But then, around the age of 17, something shifted, and it shifted dramatically. He became socially withdrawn, totally isolated from the very community he grew up in. So what on earth happened?
It really seems to boil down to two key events that sent his life into a total downward spiral: a medical diagnosis and the social rejection that came right after it.
Okay, so check out this timeline. In March of 1937, Toi gets diagnosed with tuberculosis. Now, you have to remember, in the 1930s, this wasn't just a serious illness. It was often seen as a death sentence, and it carried this massive social stigma. And right after this diagnosis, the young women in the village started to reject him. Then, to pour salt on the wound, authorities revoked his gun license, taking away one of the only things he had left.
So, from his point of view, his entire world was turning against him. The illness made him an outcast. The social rejection just made his isolation that much worse. And his resentment toward the community, well, it started to fester and turn into a lethal obsession.
And the crazy thing is, we don't have to speculate about his motives. He left them for the world to read. Before the attack, Toi wrote several long suicide notes, laying out his rationale in his own chilling words.
In his own words, this is how he saw things. He felt that once his illness became public knowledge, his neighbors completely turned on him. Now, whether this was all real or just amplified by his own paranoia, we'll never know. But this feeling of being insulted and despised, that became the core of his justification.
And this part makes it crystal clear that this was no random rampage. He explicitly stated his goal was revenge, and he planned to wait for a specific time, the time when the women who had rejected him would be home and vulnerable, to carry out his attack.
And this next part is, well, it's maybe the most disturbing piece of his logic. He explained why his grandmother, the one who raised him, was his very first victim. In his twisted mind, he believed he was sparing her. He killed her because he couldn't stand the thought of her having to live with the shame of what he was about to do.
The rampage ended almost as quickly as it began, but its memory, man, it would haunt Japan's culture for decades.
So, after his 90-minute reign of terror, after murdering 30 people and injuring 3 others, Mutsuo Toi walked to a nearby mountain and ended his own life. He was gone, leaving behind only devastation and his written justifications.
It's fascinating how this event has echoed through time. While it's not widely known around the world, the Tsuyama Massacre became the direct inspiration for numerous Japanese films, like the famous Village of Doom. The story of a community turning on one of its own, and the horrific revenge that followed, became a really powerful and recurring theme in Japanese cinema.
The story of Mutsuo Toi is an extreme and horrifying case, for sure. But it serves as this incredibly dark reminder of how profoundly social rejection can warp a human mind. It forces you to ask, right? What are the hidden costs of isolation? And what happens when a person's resentment is just left to fester in the dark until it turns into a rage that can consume an entire community?